December 7, 1941. 6:45 a.m. over the dark Pacific, a formation of Japanese bombers glides low beneath scattered clouds, engines humming like distant thunder. The island of Oahu lies 300 miles ahead, unaware, silent, sleeping. In the lead aircraft, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida studies his map under a red-lensed lamp. The plan depends on perfect surprise. No one in America must see them coming. But far below, on a remote hill at Apana Point, a radar antenna turns against the dawn. Inside a cramped canvas hut, two young U.S. Signal Corps operators stare at a glowing green screen. A faint echo appears, then another, stronger, multiplying until the entire scope shivers with movement. One whispers, "It's huge, must be hundreds." For the first time in history, a radar beam has reached across the Pacific and touched the approaching enemy. The war has already begun, they just don't know it yet. By the late 1930s, radar was still a scientific curiosity, a technology few understood and even fewer trusted. Across the Atlantic, the British had proven its potential with their chain-home system, but in America, funding was scarce and belief even scarcer. Military budgets favored ships and aircraft, not invisible beams of energy. Yet a handful of engineers at the U.S. Army Signal Corps laboratories in New Jersey pressed forward. Under Colonel William Blair, they developed the SCR-270 radar, a bulky, truck-mounted system that could detect aircraft more than 100 miles away by bouncing radio waves off their metal frames. By 1941, only 6 such stations existed in all of Hawaii. On Oahu, these radar units were manned not by seasoned officers, but by barely trained technicians, soldiers who had learned to read the blips by trial and instinct. Their equipment required constant tuning, their data had to be phoned in manually, and their authority was limited. Most senior commanders regarded radar as an experimental toy. Still, each dawn, those small teams climbed remote hillsides from Kaaua Valley to Apana Point, rotating antennas by hand, recording distant echoes from the sky. They didn't know they were guarding America's first real line of defense in the Pacific. That December morning, the men at Apana detected what no one thought possible. A formation farther, larger, and faster than any American flight had ever registered. While those young American operators studied the strange signal near Oahu, the Japanese fleet was cutting through heavy seas far to the north. A force of 6 carriers, 2 battleships, and over 350 aircraft. The Kaido Budai, the most powerful naval air armada in history, had departed Hidakapu Bay 2 weeks earlier under absolute radio silence. Its mission: strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet before it could resist Japan's advance through Asia. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan depended on perfect invisibility. Japanese reconnaissance suggested that Hawaii's defenses were blind beyond a few dozen miles. Their intelligence estimated that American radar, if it existed at all, couldn't see past the horizon. The concept of detection from 300 miles away seemed scientifically impossible. In Japan's war rooms, the belief in surprise was near religious. Pilots were briefed to expect no warning, no scramble, only confusion when they arrived over Pearl Harbor. It was this confidence, that technological backwardness would guarantee success, that allowed them to fly so boldly into American airspace. What they didn't know was that months earlier, the U.S. Signal Corps had linked Hawaii's few radar stations into a crude network. Data lines fed into a central hub near Fort Shafter, an embryonic information center designed to relay warnings to the Army Air Corps and the Navy. The system was primitive, the procedures unclear, but it existed. When the radar at Apana Point picked up the incoming wave at 7:02 a.m., the United States briefly held an advantage no one realized it possessed: the ability to see the unseen. The SCR-270 radar was an ungainly giant, 2 trucks, 30 feet of antenna, humming vacuum tubes that glowed faintly in the dark. Its rotating beam pulsed every 5 seconds, sending radio energy through the humid air and waiting for echoes to return. Each pulse painted a faint green curve across a cathode ray tube, a living heartbeat of the sky. The operators at Apana Point, Privates Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, had been trained for only a few weeks. Yet they understood their instrument better than most officers. That morning, when the echoes appeared, they watched as the signal grew from a faint arc to a solid wall of light. Lockard measured it carefully, over 130 miles away, moving fast, too fast for any known American aircraft. The system's sensitivity was working beyond design limits. The radar had done something its creators only theorized. It had tracked an enemy long before the human eye could see the horizon. Inside that tiny operations truck, the air was thick with heat and ozone. The men wore headsets, surrounded by humming power units and the rhythmic sweep of the beam. They were only 21 and 19 years old, spending their Sunday morning practicing for a system few took seriously. When the echoes appeared, Elliot called out the range, 130 miles, and Lockard, stunned, told him to keep plotting. By regulation, they were to report any large contact to headquarters. Lockard picked up the field phone, unaware that the next voice he'd reach would dismiss what might have been the most important sighting in American history. When Lockard's report reached the information center near Fort Shafter, it was received by Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, an Army Air Corps officer on temporary duty. He had been on the job for less than 2 days. The duty chart listed a scheduled flight of B-17 Flying Fortresses inbound from California that morning, and to Tyler the blip matched their path. He thanked the operator and told him, "Don't worry about it." No alarm was raised. No interceptors scrambled. The radar network, so carefully built, failed not because the machine was wrong, but because the people above it couldn't yet believe it was right. The United States had seen its enemy coming, but didn't know how to interpret what it saw. Aboard the Japanese carriers, pilots prepared for launch with quiet efficiency. They had trained for months under the assumption that America's early warning systems were non-existent. Japan's military scientists had studied Western radar technology, but concluded it was too bulky, too fragile, and too short-ranged for practical use at sea. The thought that ground stations on Oahu could track them across hundreds of miles never crossed their minds. When post-war interrogations revealed the Americans had detected their approach, surviving pilots reacted with disbelief. One recalled, "If they saw us from that far, why didn't they stop us?" It was a question that haunted strategists for years, a symbol of how information means nothing without trust. Both sides had misjudged the other. The Americans trusted too little in their own invention. The Japanese trusted too much in their secrecy. Between them lay a gap of understanding that would change modern warfare. In that moment, radar proved itself not as an experimental curiosity, but as the invisible eye of a new age. 7:02 a.m., the signal from Apana Point strengthened until it filled the screen. Private Lockard watched as the echoes converged, reading over 50 aircraft, then 100, then far more. He phoned the information center again, uncertain whether anyone truly understood what he was seeing. At that same moment, 130 miles north of Oahu, First Wave Commander Mitsuo Fuchida gave the order to descend. The bombers broke formation and spread into attack groups, torpedo, dive, and high level, the tip of Japan's strike arm. The radar station's generator hummed as Lockard adjusted the gain. The beam swept again and again, the formation moving closer at 180 miles per hour. The island below still slept. At 7:39 a.m., radar contact ceased as the planes dropped below the horizon. The system had tracked them for nearly an hour, a warning window large enough to have scrambled every American fighter on Oahu. Inside the control center, Lieutenant Tyler logged the report as friendly inbound. The blips were forgotten. Down at Wheeler Field, mechanics drank coffee beside parked P-40s, unaware that the radar had already drawn their enemy's path. When the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m., the shock was total. Yet in the confusion and smoke, a few officers remembered the call from Apana, the one that had seemed unimportant. In that instant, America's faith in radar changed forever. By the time the second wave roared over Oahu, the War Department had realized that their invisible line of defense had worked perfectly. It was people, not machines, that had failed to respond. Far above the Pacific, the Japanese formation glittered in the sunlight, fighters in tight formation, bombers steady as iron swans. Their commanders believed they had achieved perfect surprise. But at that very moment, in a small operations room on Oahu, officers were piecing together fragments of reports, radar detection, radio intercepts, and a series of strange, unacknowledged messages. The pattern was there, but understanding came minutes too late. At 7:55 a.m., the first explosions shattered Pearl Harbor. Battleship Row erupted in flames. The USS Arizona split apart. The smoke columns were visible from the North Shore, where Lockhart and Elliott watched in silence, realizing what they had seen on their screen had been real all along. Their warning had been the first recorded radar detection of an enemy strike in American history. The irony was brutal. The technology had done its job flawlessly, but the system of command around it had not yet evolved to act on what it revealed. The chain of communication was too slow, the hierarchy too rigid, and belief too fragile. Yet from those minutes of confusion, a new doctrine began to take shape. In the following days, engineers, officers, and scientists swarmed Hawaii, studying the equipment, analyzing the logs, interviewing the operators. The conclusion was unmistakable. Radar had not failed. Radar had succeeded. The United States had, for one fleeting hour, possessed the most advanced early warning system on Earth. It had simply been ignored. What followed would reshape the American approach to warfare. The creation of a true radar information network, the integration of radar into air defense, and the recognition that information, if not trusted, was as useless as silence. The lesson was harsh, and it was written in fire over Oahu. When the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, 2,403 Americans were dead, and much of the Pacific Fleet lay crippled in the harbor. Yet buried in the wreckage was a revelation that would redefine modern defense. Radar had seen the enemy first. In the immediate aftermath, the War Department dispatched teams from the Signal Corps, the Army Air Forces, and the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics to investigate why the warning wasn't acted upon. Reports from Apana Point showed the radar's exact readings, times, and distances, all correct. For Washington, the implications were staggering. The young operators who once worked in obscurity were suddenly interviewed by generals. Their equipment, once dismissed as experimental, became the foundation of a new doctrine. Within weeks, funds poured into expanding radar coverage across the Pacific and continental United States. What had been 6 primitive stations in Hawaii would soon become hundreds of towers scanning every coast. The tragedy at Pearl Harbor had revealed the truth. Seeing the enemy meant nothing if the message died in bureaucracy. From that day forward, America vowed never again to ignore the echoes in the dark. By early 1942, the United States was racing to transform its vulnerability into dominance. The newly formed Aircraft Warning Service began linking radar, ground observers, and fighter command into a single coordinated network. Across the Pacific, stations rose on islands like Midway, Wake, and Guadalcanal, each equipped with improved SCR-271 and SCR-527 sets. The same invisible waves that once went unheard would soon guide interceptors, direct anti-aircraft batteries, and shield convoys under night skies. For Japan, the revelation came only after the war. During interrogations, surviving pilots and naval officers were stunned to learn that their approach had been detected hundreds of miles out. "We thought your eyes ended at the horizon," one said. Their confidence in secrecy had been absolute. Discovering that American radar had seen them before they ever saw Hawaii was a humiliation few forgot. That discovery marked a turning point not only for the Pacific War, but for warfare itself. From that morning on, battles would be fought not merely by those who fired first, but by those who saw first. Radar could not stop the bombs from falling that morning, but it ended an era when nations fought blind. In a single hour, the world learned that the horizon was no longer a shield, that unseen waves could reach across oceans and change the outcome of wars. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose a new kind of defense built not on armor or numbers, but on awareness. For the young soldiers at Apana Point, the memory would never fade, the moment when technology glimpsed the enemy before human understanding could catch up. Their warning, ignored in 1941, became the foundation of every radar network that followed, from the skies over Normandy to the early satellites of the Cold War. The Japanese pilots who once trusted the clouds for cover had discovered a new truth. In modern war, it is not silence that protects you, but vision.